By the way, before we get into the sermon, I would appreciate your prayers that I make it back to Gladewater and Kilgore in a safe fashion this afternoon. Yesterday, when I left yesterday morning, I got just a few miles up the road, and all of a sudden my car started running hot. That's not a good sign. And I got hotter and hotter. Finally it got over into the hot zone. I pulled off and waited for a few minutes, and then when it cooled down, the first service station I could get to that had some antifreeze. I checked the car when I pulled over, and I noticed that there wasn't any coolant in the reservoir there. So I said, well, don't know what happened to it, but I'll add some. Well, that seemed to solve the problem. Things went pretty good, and I got on up to Oklahoma City, and when I checked the coolant again, well, there still wasn't any. It was after I'd gotten up there, and I added some more, and I made it back down to Ardmore okay. And this morning, well, it was down again. It wasn't any, or was just down at the very bottom of the reservoir, so I added some more, and I made it in down here, but it kept getting running in the high side of normal, so I don't know, whatever the problem is, seems to be getting worse, I know where I plan on being the first thing Monday morning is at the Buick dealership in Kilgore, but if I can get there some way other than a tow truck would be nice. Anyway, they may have to wait services on me or something if I come riding in a tow truck, but anyway, one way or the other, I'm sure it'll work out, but anyway. Always little things that keep life interesting, right? But, nothing just goes uneventful. Brethren, I want to call your attention this morning to a particular book in the New Testament that was very important in terms of explaining some things for the first century church. It addressed some questions that certainly the Jewish converts had. It was written at a crucial time, and it was very important, addressed some very important matters for them. But it's not just merely from a historical standpoint or from the standpoint of what was of value to them that we want to look at this book, because there are some very important things for us and some important lessons to have in mind. The book that I have reference to is a book written by the Apostle Paul, the book of Hebrews. Now, before we go there, let's set a little bit of the stage by going back to Acts chapter 22. Acts 21, excuse me. Paul had come back from his third evangelistic journey and had returned and come into the port there in Caesarea, and then we're told that in verse 15 of Acts 21 that he went up to Jerusalem, and some of the brethren there from Caesarea also went up, and they came up to Jerusalem, verse 17, and the brethren received us gladly. And the following day Paul went in with us unto James, and James, the brother of Jesus, was the one who presided over the headquarters church. And all the elders were present. So they had a ministerial meeting. Paul came in there. When he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. So he gave them an update, a report, and they were very happy when they heard it. Verse 20. The idea, by the way, in much of the so-called scholarly theological circles is the fact that really, Paul had sort of one approach, and James and the Jerusalem church had some totally different approach. And that's not true at all. James and the elders there in Jerusalem were delighted when they heard Paul's news. There wasn't some great conflict between them. It was a misperception, and there were reasons why things were misperceived, because they were in different areas, they were dealing with different situations, but they were in total harmony and agreement in terms of God's Word and God's plan and what God would have us do. So Paul was received gladly by the brethren in Jerusalem. When he went into James and all the elders and told them what had transpired since the last time he had talked to them, gave them an update on the work among the Gentiles, when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. They were thankful. And they said unto him, Do you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law? Now, Paul didn't say, oh, that's terrible. Haven't you told them that's done away? No. Paul knew that the law wasn't done away, and they knew that it wasn't done away. He said, these thousands of Jews which believe, we've had a great response here in this area, in Judea and Galilee. They're all zealous of the law. And they are informed of you, verse 21. They've heard some rumors that aren't true. James knew it wasn't true. Paul knew it wasn't true. But he said, they're informed of you that you teach all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Now let me ask you, what customs was he referring? To which customs was he referring? Is there some great issue about the Ten Commandments? No. Notice what James told him as to how James told him to resolve this rumor. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together. They will hear that you're come. Now, do therefore this that we say unto you. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify yourself with them, be it charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. And as touching the Gentiles which believe, we've written and concluded that they observe no such thing. Now, what such thing? Well, the very thing that James is talking about. He's talking about things that relate to the temple ritual. You see, you had to be circumcised in order to take part in the temple ritual. And here, it involved 4 individuals who had taken a vow, evidently a Nazirite vow, because it was at the end of a Nazirite vow that they shaved their heads and offerings were made in the temple. What we have to understand at this point, which is, let's say, the very late 50s A.D., the temple was still standing. The temple was still there. There were thousands of the Jews in the Jerusalem area, and they regularly went to the temple. Why would they do that? Well, what Bible did they have? What were the Scriptures? What you and I would call the Old Testament. The New Testament, much of it hadn't even been written yet. It was in the process of being compiled. By the time we're looking here, perhaps a couple of the Gospels, maybe Matthew and Mark had been completed by this time, but probably no more than that. Some of Paul's epistles had been written, a few of those, but that's really about it. There wasn't a whole lot of the New Testament that had been completed by this point in the 50s A.D. When people studied the Bible, what did they study? Well, they studied the Torah, they studied the prophets, the law, the prophets, and the writings. They studied what we call the Old Testament. Now, there was nothing in what they studied to tell them that they needed to quit going to the temple, to tell them that they needed to disregard the instructions that they could plainly read in the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. There are all sorts of instructions that are specified about where God has set His name. Now, the Jews there in Jerusalem, they were zealous of the law. Not simply that they were keeping the 10 Commandments, because the Gentiles scattered throughout the Roman Empire who were, quote, God-fearers, they kept the 10 Commandments. I think I went through that in a sermon back several weeks ago. Various things that the extent to which Sabbath keeping and various things like that had spread among the Gentile population in the Roman Empire, many of whom regularly attended the synagogue. But you have to understand, the rituals and the ceremonies did not take place in the synagogue. The synagogue was the place where the law was read, where the Scriptures were read. You know, you and I take for granted that we have our Bibles. And virtually everybody here's got a Bible with you today. And back home you probably have several more. And some of you may have Bibles online. And you can look and see all sorts of things. But, you know, there's no shortage of Bibles. And there are Bibles all over the place. That was not the case in the first century. You know, can you imagine what this book would cost if you had to pay an educated person to sit down and copy it by hand? You have to pay an educated person because he's got to be able to read and write well, and you know, it took skill as a scribe. If you've ever tried to write with an old goose quill pen or something like that you dip in a bottle of ink, I can remember doing that back as a kid, and my mother made me quit plucking some tail feathers out of the chickens, but I had read about that, and I was sort of interested in that. And you know, back in those olden days, it still wasn't that hard to buy bottles of ink that you could buy. You know, you could just dip it in there. Well, I'll tell you something. It's not quite as simple as you might think, in terms of avoiding to blotch it up and make a mess out of it. And it's even more complicated when you are writing on something like papyrus or vellum, because if you don't have just exactly the right pressure, what you find is that there's sort of a capillary effect, and the ink just it drains out, makes a blot. Paper takes it a little better, you know, depends on the kind of paper. You have certain kinds of paper, and it soaks up the ink. So the materials that they were writing, you had to be pretty skilled. It wasn't just a matter of being able to read. There were a lot of people who could read who were not able to copy out books. If you notice, Paul generally had someone actually had a scribe normally actually write his book. He would dedicate it. He would dictate it to them. Sometimes he would write a portion with his own hand, but that's why you read about the scribes. They were a very it was a skilled profession. You had to be able to deftly handle the ink and the writing materials they had, to be able to write it in a clear, smooth way without blotches and that sort of thing. So you're hiring a skilled workman. And he is spending many hours. I don't know how many hours it'll take to copy the Bible, but you're looking at a lot of hours. So you don't have to do a whole lot of figuring to figure you're holding in your hands what would have cost multiple thousands of dollars. Multiple thousands of dollars in order to have a book like that, because you're having to hire somebody's time to spend how many weeks, how many months that you're sitting there doing this sort of thing. Quite a while. The point being that Bibles were very expensive. And normally the whole community had a Bible that they shared there in the synagogue, and they were on scrolls. So there were different books were on different scrolls, so you could study different things. You know, people would come to the synagogue, they would hear the Scriptures read. They could come to the synagogue and they could read the Scriptures themselves. There were copies there, because it wasn't just in one book, but it was in multiple scrolls. Different people could sit there and study or read all at the same time. And there was a regular systematic pattern of reading the Scriptures to the congregation when they assembled on the Sabbath. So people were regularly hearing these things. They were studying it. And that's what went on in the synagogue. It wasn't the place where sacrifices and ceremonies and rituals took place. It was the place where you went to hear the Word of God read, and then you had an opportunity to discuss after the reading of the law. It was a place where you could go and study, where you had access to the Scriptures. Now, there was not a problem with Gentiles assembling in the synagogue and hearing the law, hearing the Scriptures. There had been a decision made in Acts chapter 15 about the things that related to the Gentiles as opposed to the Jews. The issue of circumcision was never a matter of telling the Jews that they shouldn't circumcise their children, but it was a symbol of the covenant with Abraham, but it was not something that was required for salvation, and so it was not a matter that Gentiles who were converted and came into the church had to then go and perform these rituals. So, the Gentiles which believe, verse 25 of Acts 21, we've written and concluded that they observe no such thing, except only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things that are strangled, and from immorality. Now, those requirements come right out of the law back in Leviticus, 17 and 18, I believe. Leviticus 17 and 18. That came right out of the law, and it pertained to the strangers among Israel. But in terms of the rituals that were carried out. So the issue here, what we find is that the Jewish community in Jerusalem and Jews from elsewhere in the church still, when they would come up to Jerusalem, regularly took part in the ceremonies going on in the temple. It had never occurred to them not to. Why should they not? They saw all sorts of instructions about those ceremonies in the Scriptures that they read and studied. Now, rumors had gone around about Paul that Paul was teaching the Jews among the... and consider here, the customs relating to Nazirite vows and such things. If rumor about that created an uproar, can you imagine if Paul had been teaching people to eat pork and work on the Sabbath? How much more uproar would that have caused? That would have been a far greater issue. The rumor going around had to do with circumcision of Jewish children, and it had to do with various customs or ritual requirements. You see, James didn't say, let everybody see you go to church on Saturday instead of Sunday this week. He said, we've got some men who have made a vow. You go up to the temple and participate in the ceremony with them. That way everyone will see that you take part in these customs, and you are certainly not in some way disparaging that to the Jewish population, to the Jewish community. And so Paul was happy to do that. He took the men, verse 26, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until then an offering should be offered for every one of them. So Paul had no problem with participating in the temple ceremonies. Now, that is a background, understanding the fact that the Jewish community, or those Jews who were converted, who learned the truth, recognizing that Jesus was the Messiah prophesied and promised in the Scriptures, in the law and the prophets. For the Jews, it didn't make some huge difference in the way that they regularly lived and conducted their lives. They observed the Sabbath. They continued to do all of these things, right on down to the ceremonies in the temple. But you see, within just a matter of a few years, in fact, within just over 10 years after this account in Acts 21, the temple would be no more. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. Now, Paul wrote the book of Hebrews perhaps about 3 years or so after this account in Acts 21. He wrote the book of Hebrews probably around 60 AD, 60, 61, perhaps 61. That Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. He was being released in Rome and was about to be free to travel again. Because if you remember, things took a little different twist and turn than James or Paul or any of the others foresaw. Because while Paul went in to take part in the ceremonies there in the temple, he was falsely accused of something that he had not done. He precipitated his arrest, and then this thing dragged on for years before finally he was released. And that story is in the remainder of the book of Acts. But I wanted to set the background for it a little bit, because Paul, writing from Rome, and Paul said, let's just notice the very end of Hebrews chapter 13, that verse 22, he says, I beseech you, brethren, suffer the word of exhortation, for I've written a letter unto you in few words, just a short letter. Know you that our brother Timothy is set at liberty, with whom, if he comes shortly, I will see you. Salute all them that have the rule over you and all the saints. They of Italy salute you. So, evidently, by the time Paul wrote this, he had been released from prison in Rome. Timothy, who seems to have been briefly detained, had been set at liberty, and Paul was hoping to make a trip with Timothy coming back to Jerusalem. Now, we don't know the ins and outs of that, because the book of Acts ends by just telling us that Paul was in prison in Rome 2 years. And when you put the rest of the Scripture together, the book of Acts just ends abruptly. But Paul is writing this at the time he's writing the book of Hebrews, writing it only about 9 years before the temple was destroyed. Understand what that was going to mean. Now, there are several things. One, to realize that the Jewish church, the Jewish community, many of those brethren had been in the church for decades. If you're getting on into the 60s AD, then you're looking at over 30 years since the day of Pentecost, or right at 30 years. 61 AD would be 30 years from the time of that day of Pentecost described in Acts 2. So you're looking at many people who had been in the church. There was phenomenal growth, remember, in those early years. There were many in the Jewish community who had been in the church for 20, 30 years. There were some of them that even would have had a first-hand memory of having heard Jesus Christ personally. Now, time had gone on in a way that they had not expected, and I think we'll see that as we notice some things in Hebrews. Things had lasted longer. You remember the excitement and the exuberance at the beginning of the New Testament church there in Acts 2? You had people who liquidated property, sold assets in order to allow those from out of town to just stay there. Things were happening in such a dramatic way. Peter told them that these miracles that were taking place were a fulfillment of the book of Joel. And he quoted some of the verses from Joel 2. Now, if you read Joel 2 and Joel 3, you find that you start out with these great miracles and you proceed right on into the day of the Lord. It would not have been an unusual conclusion for people to have assumed that if what they were experiencing, what they were seeing, was the beginning of what Joel prophesied, that the whole thing was going to wrap up. If you remember the last question the disciples asked Jesus, they said, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel, just as He's getting ready to ascend? And He said, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons that the Father has reserved into His own power. You go back to Jerusalem and wait until you're imbued with power, and then go forth and carry out the job I've given you to do. So, what has happened as these years have gone by? One is a certain lethargy, a certain waning of zeal, a certain discouragement has set in. There are problems that have occurred that most of these people were not expecting. You know, Paul talked about, even in writings that he had made several years earlier, about those coming with a different gospel. Talked about that in his letter to the Corinthians, one of his letters to the Corinthians. He had talked about in his letters to the Thessalonians, written in the very early 50s, somewhere around 50 AD, Paul talked about how the mystery of iniquity was already at work. And something was holding it back, but it was already at work. There were problems and difficulties. There were heresies. There were all sorts of things that were beginning to happen. And they weren't just beginning to happen. What Paul clearly understood under God's inspiration was they were going to get a whole lot worse in the next few years. The temple was going to be destroyed, and Christ wasn't going to be back immediately at that time. Now, if there were problems that had set in at this point, consider what would happen next. And consider the fact that when the temple was no longer there, that it was going to have a significant impact on people who had regularly, from the time, their earliest memories, their religious life had centered around the temple. So, with that in mind, Paul wrote this book. Now, Paul was perhaps better qualified to write a book that went into the intricacies and the details of the law, because remember, Paul had been educated at the feet of Gamaliel, who was the most noted Jewish teacher of that time. So Paul had a lot of credentials. He had studied and had technical knowledge and background in terms of the Scriptures in a way that most did not. And so he was, in a unique way, qualified to write a book such as this. And in writing this book, there are several things that he addresses. The book of Hebrews centers on Jesus Christ and His role. That, first and foremost, is what is stressed throughout. Because there were Jews who had the idea that you could accept Jesus as the Messiah, but they didn't really understand who the Messiah was. Is the Messiah simply human? Is the Messiah the son of David? Remember, Christ had he had a little satisfaction out of the Pharisees, because they were always trying to trip Him up with questions. And one day He said, "Well, I've got a question for you fellas. You're learned men, right?" Oh yeah, they were learned men, knew the Scriptures. He said, "Well, let me ask you something. Whose son is the Messiah? How does the Bible speak of the Messiah?" I said, "Well, the Messiah is the son of David. He's the son of David." "Oh, okay. Well, let me ask you a question then. How is it that David, speaking under inspiration of the Holy Spirit," and then he quotes from back in the Psalms about how, the Lord said unto my Lord, Yahweh, the Eternal, said unto my Lord, "Sit you on my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." He said, if David called Him Lord, then how is it that you say He's His son? Well, boy, that left them scratching their heads. They couldn't explain that, because they didn't really understand the nature and role of the Messiah. They understood that there was a Messiah to come. They looked upon Him as the son of Abraham, the son of David. They understood that He was the promised seed, that He was the descendant of David. But in terms of understanding His pre-existence, in terms of understanding the full nature of the Godhead, most of the Jews didn't. There are some hints of it in the Old Testament if you read them carefully, but they tended to read right over those things. They didn't understand it. And the tendency is, if you don't understand something, if it doesn't fit in, you just skip over it and go on to something else. And that's what they did on some of these verses. Christ brought them to their attention, and they, of course, didn't appreciate that. Paul, now, in the book of Hebrews, goes into the most detailed exposition. He has said some things in some of his writings, some of his epistles, and more in the prison epistles, which had probably been written just prior to the book of Hebrews. But John, writing in 1 John and in the Gospel of John, was still over 30 years in the future. So the explanations that John gave about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God, that hadn't been written yet. So Paul spends a great deal of time in the book of Hebrews, first and foremost, concentrating on who is Jesus Christ. What is His role? What's He doing right now? What is He doing right now? Secondarily, Paul focused attention on what should we be doing right now. What should be our response to God's initiative in our lives. And then along with these two themes, Paul also explained about the transition in terms of the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. He explained about the transition in terms of worship and gives a background that the rituals, the ceremonies, the various things connected with ceremonial worship under the Old Covenant were things that pictured the reality of what Jesus Christ was and is doing. You know, the Sabbath was not a ritual that was a part of the Old Covenant. It was not a ritual. It was a day that God had made holy, and He made it holy all the way back in creation week. God made the Sabbath holy before sin ever entered into the world. The Sabbath was not some sort of a ritual or something of that sort. God sanctified it, made it holy. You can read that in Genesis 2, first couple of verses. Before Israel ever arrived at Mount Sinai, God emphasized to them the Sabbath and gave them the miracle of the manna, where it started coming on a Sunday, came for 6 days, and then skipped the Sabbath, and then started up again for another 6 days. So God gave them that and emphasized to them the importance of keeping the Sabbath before they had ever come to Mount Sinai, before they had ever entered into the Sinai covenant. Noah understood about clean and unclean meat way back at the time of the flood. God told him to put the clean animals on by twos and the unclean animals on by twos and the clean animals on by sevens. Noah didn't have to ask what is clean and unclean. He knew. He didn't have a question, well, if I give the pig a bath, does that make him a clean animal? Noah knew what was clean and what was unclean. That was centuries and centuries before the Old Covenant. Abraham, we're told, had sheep and goats and cattle. There's nothing said about Abraham being a swineherd. When Christ and the two angels came to Abraham's tent there in Genesis 18, and Abraham served him a meal, he didn't say, go kill the fatted pig. He killed the fatted calf. He killed the calf, and they roasted the meat and had this meal. The point is, some of these things were understood long before the Sinai covenant. They weren't distinctly a part of it. They were things that had been in force and effect from the beginning. But there were rituals and ceremonies centering around the tabernacle and the temple. All of the rituals, if you go back to Exodus, the rituals centered around the tabernacle and later the temple. The temple was built on the pattern of the tabernacle. It was just a permanent structure where the tabernacle had been a temporary structure, one that you could put up and take down and move. So the ceremonies all centered around that. You see, the customs, as it mentions in Acts 21, the things that were being practiced were things that involved the temple. You couldn't take a Nazirite vow. You couldn't do that without the temple. You couldn't do that today because you couldn't follow the instructions. You can't do a halfway job of it. If you're going to do something, you've got to follow the instructions God gives. And part of the instructions were, at the end of it, you had to shave your head and bring in this particular offering to the temple and be accepted by the priest. And the hair was burned there as well as an offering to God. Well, you can't do that because there's not a temple, there's not an altar, there's not a functioning priesthood in that way. So the ceremonies centered around the temple. Now, within a short time of when Paul wrote this, there was going to be no more temple. Did that mean that all of those scriptures in the Old Testament that talked about the tabernacle and the temple and the ceremonies, did that mean that those had no longer any meaning? No. If you understood what they were really talking about, the fact that those ceremonies were a type. Paul explains that. See, he's the one who uses the word. They were a type. They were a figure for the time then present. They were an illustration for that point in time to illustrate certain aspects of what God is doing. So Paul deals with the transition. He deals with who and what is Jesus Christ. What is He doing right now? What is His role? Who is He? What is His role? He deals with what should be our response as time drags on. And as you find life drawing to a close, how do you respond? Paul addresses that. And then from a third standpoint, he deals with transition issues in explaining the transition to people who are going to live through that transition. Now notice how he starts here in Hebrews chapter 1. I can tell we better pick up speed if we're going to get... we haven't even gotten to verse 1 yet, have we? God, who at sundry times and in different manners, at various times in different ways, God spoke in the past, in times past, unto the fathers by the prophets. In various ways. Sometimes God gave them a dream. Sometimes He sent an angel to deliver a message. Sometimes, in the case of Moses, He spoke to him face to face. In different ways, at various times in the past, God has spoken to His people through the prophets. From Moses right on down, through Samuel and through the Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all sorts of people that God had raised up. The same God has in these last days spoken unto us by His Son. So Paul now makes a contrast between the revelation given in the past and the revelation given right now. He spoke in various ways through the prophets in times past, but now He's spoken unto us by His Son. Who is the Son? Whom He's appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. Oh, okay, so this Son is not just... Jesus did not come into existence when He was born of the Virgin Mary. That was not the beginning of Jesus Christ, because it's by Him, by Jesus Christ, the one who's appointed heir of all things, by whom also He, God, made the worlds, the universe. All the things that are made were made by Jesus Christ. Paul explains that in the book of Colossians as well. Oh, so then understanding about Christ goes way beyond just looking at the beginning of His human life. In fact, going on, who being the brightness of His glory, talking about Christ being the brightness of the Father's glory, and the express image of His person, upholding all things by the word of His power, when He had by Himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high, being made so much better than the angels, as He has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. So, Paul starts out by putting the focus on Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the instrument of creation. Jesus Christ is the one who, by Himself, purged our sins. And Jesus Christ, in the aftermath of that, sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high, on the right hand of the Father. So, Paul puts a focus. Where's Jesus Christ right now? Well, He's sitting on a throne right next to the Father. And Jesus Christ paid for our sins. He purged our sins. And Jesus Christ is the instrument of creation. He pre-existed. He came and He fulfilled the role, and now He's alive, and He's sitting right there at the Father's right hand, being made so much better than the angels. Christ is not an angel, as various ones have taught. So much better than the angels. Unto which of the angels did He ever say at any time, "You are my Son, this day have I begotten you"? And again, I'll be to him a father, and he'll be to me a son. When did God say that to the angels? You're my son. This day have I begotten you. Well, if you that is a quote from back in the Psalms, Psalm 2. In Psalm 2, and we'll pick it up in verse 6. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree, the Eternal has said unto me, You are my son, this day have I begotten you. Ask of me, and I'll give you the nations for your inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. So, this wasn't an angel that was being addressed. God never spoke to the angels that way, saying, You're my son. Again, verse 6, when he brings the first begotten into the world, he says, And let all the angels of God worship him. And of the angels, he says, who makes his angels spirits, and his ministers a flame of fire. But unto the Son, he says, Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore God, even your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your fellows. Now, here again is one of the scriptures in the Old Testament. This is quoted from Psalm 45. In fact, let's just turn there. We won't do that very often, but let me just call your attention to the context here. In Psalm 45, and verse 6, Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a right scepter. You love righteousness and hate wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your fellows. Realize that the word Messiah comes from the Hebrew word that means the anointed one. It says, God, your God, has anointed you. So here's one who is addressed as God. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Therefore God, who is your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness. You know, you're the Messiah, the anointed one. One of these clear scriptures showing, right along with John 1 and other places. There were hints in the Old Testament, but it was not something clearly understood. So Paul clearly emphasizes in Hebrews chapter 1 the fact that Jesus Christ is not simply a person. He's not even an angel. He's God. And He's seated right now at the right hand of the Father. You know, when you read of the angels in the presence of God, you read of them standing in God's presence to take direction or instruction. You read of them kneeling before God or praising God. But you don't read of them sitting down in God's, sitting there at His right hand. Well, that was the special place that was reserved for Jesus Christ. There's a great contrast. So it says, coming on down verse 10, You, Lord, in the beginning have laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They'll wax old. You'll fold them up. You see, the heavens would pass away. There will be a new heavens and a new earth. The heavens and the earth, verse 12, see, they shall be changed, but you are the same. Your years shall not fail. God's not going to get old. You know, the physical creation winds down. It runs down. It will ultimately be replaced. But God doesn't wind down. His years shall not fail. He's the same, even though everything in the physical realm changes. To which of the angels did He say, At any time, sit on my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool? They're ministering spirits sent forth to minister to them who be the heirs of salvation. So, the angels are not heirs of God. They are ministering spirits. They are servants that were designed and created for that purpose. So, Paul starts out by laying emphasis on the supremacy, the superiority of Jesus Christ. Now, he ties in with our response, chapter 2. We ought to give the more earnest heed to the things that we've heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. You see, if you go back to the Old Testament, you'll find that some of the revelation that was given to Moses was given by the hand of an angel. The point that Paul is drawing here is if the word spoken by angels was steadfast, and all the transgressions, everything brought a consequence, then the contrast is how are we going to escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken unto us by the Lord and was confirmed to us by them that heard it. If you first understand the superiority of Jesus Christ, then you realize that it is even more important to hold fast, to hold on to what Christ has delivered. Because if Christ is way superior to the angels, then what came from Him is something that ought to be given very special heed. Now, Paul now begins here in chapter 2 and going on down in chapter 3 and 4, making a contrast between God's people today and the people of Israel who came out of Egypt. And it shows, you see, that the word did them, as we're told, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 2. Unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. Now here's an important key. It's not enough to know the truth. Israel of old, who heard the Word of God, knew the truth, didn't they? They heard God proclaim the Ten Commandments. They didn't have to afterwards say, now I wonder which day He meant by that. What did He say? Did He say 7 or did He say first? I didn't quite catch that. They knew what God said. They had the truth. They had what God spoke. They had what God wrote with His own finger. They had what God gave to Moses. The word preached did not profit them because it wasn't mixed with faith. It's not enough to have the truth. You need the truth plus faith. Because if you have the truth and don't have faith, then you don't act on the truth that you have. You can have it in a book sitting on the shelf. I have occasion to stay in a lot of motels, and virtually every one that I ever have occasion to go into, they've got Bible there. Most of the cases, those Bibles have rarely been opened. You can tell the pages still stick together. The binding is stiff, and I've opened a number of them, and I really figure I was the first person to ever open it because the pages are still, it's like a brand new book when you open it, and it's stiff, and everything sort of sticks together. You see, the truth is readily available. The book is everywhere, at least in our land, our culture. But if it's not mixed with faith in those that hear it or those that read it, what does it profit? And that's what Paul says. You see, ancient Israel, it wasn't mixed with faith, and so obedience did not follow. Obedience doesn't follow just from having the truth or knowing the truth. Obedience follows from believing the truth. If you've got faith and trust God, then you will act on that. Because real faith produces works, produces actions. So Paul then emphasizes this and how they didn't receive the promises God made to them because they didn't trust Him, and because they didn't trust Him, they didn't follow Him. And if you don't follow Him, then you don't get to the destination. Because He's the only one that knows how to get there. So how can you get there if you don't follow Him? You make your own path. And Paul emphasized here, notice here, that in Hebrews 2 verse 5, he says, unto the angels has He not put in subjection the world to come whereof we speak. But one in a certain place testifies, what is man that you're mindful of him? He's quoting from Psalm 8. What is man that you're mindful of him, the Son of Man that you visit him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor. Did set him over the works of your hands. You put all things in subjection under his feet. In that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we see not yet all things put under him. What we do see is Jesus, who was made a little lower, or made temporarily lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. It became him for whom are all things and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. Jesus Christ is the captain of our salvation. God is bringing many sons unto glory. See, Paul emphasizes our destiny and the fact that it far rises above and supersedes anything pertaining to the angels. Now, in chapter 3, wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Jesus Christ. He now introduces Christ as the high priest. Now, in chapter 3, he emphasizes that Christ is superior to Moses. Well, that was really a big step for, certainly some of the Jews that were sort of marginal. They thought Moses was, how could you be better than Moses? Well, Paul explains, he said, now Moses was faithful, verse 2. Moses was faithful. But he says in verse 3, this man was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he that built the house has more honor than the house. Every house is built by some man, but he that builds all things is God. Moses truly was faithful in all his house as a servant. But Christ, verse 6, as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence. So, showing Christ is superior to the angels, Christ is superior to Moses, Christ is the Son, He's the one by whom God made all things, He's the one who upholds everything by the word of His power, He is now seated at the right hand of the Majesty on high, He by Himself purged our sins, He's the captain of our salvation. So Paul is explaining many things in a very clear-cut fashion. And now he is tying that in with our response. You see, it's not just a matter of what God does. You and I have to respond to God's grace. God's grace was demonstrated in His dealings with ancient Israel. He brought them out of Egypt. He brought them to Sinai, entered into a covenant with them. He blessed them. He watched over them. He gave them much. The problem was they did not respond to what God gave them through faith. And that is the response that it takes to be acceptable of God. Abraham responded to God through faith. And he was accounted the friend of God. So, in chapter 4, Paul goes on through and explains how that the rest into which Joshua led the people was temporary. It didn't last. It was a type of the Sabbath. And that's where Paul uses a particular word for rest that just means rest or repose through the first 7 verses of, or first 8 verses of Hebrews 4. Katapozos just means rest, just like our English word. But in verse 9, he uses a different word. It's translated, if you just read the King James, you'd think it's the same word. But in many Bibles, there is a little marginal note that explains this as a different word. It's the word sabbatismos. You don't have to be some great Greek scholar to figure out sabbatismos probably has something to do with Sabbath. It just means a Sabbath keeping. There remains, therefore, a Sabbath keeping to the people of God. For he that's entered into his rest, into God's rest, he also has ceased from his own work as God did from his. Now, the only place in the Bible you read about God ceasing from His work is back in Genesis 2, when God ceased from His work and rested on the Sabbath. And then you find that quoted later on in Exodus 20. Well, if you enter into God's rest, then you have to cease from your work just like God did from His. Well, that's why there remains a Sabbath keeping to God's people. Let's labor to enter into that rest. lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. So now he begins emphasizing in the remainder of chapter 4. He introduces Christ as our high priest in the beginning of chapter 3. On through this remainder of chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, Paul emphasizes Christ's role, even on into the beginning of chapter 8, he emphasizes Christ's role as high priest. Because if you understand Christ's role as high priest, then it makes a lot of things fit and come together. You see, we have, Hebrews 4:14, we have a great high priest that's passed into the heavens, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So we have a high priest. He's not the fellow who's officiating over in the temple in Jerusalem. That's not the real high priest these days, Paul is telling us. We have a great high priest, and he's not in the temple in Jerusalem. He's in heaven at the very throne of God. Because what Paul went on to explain to them was all of the things you see in the temple, all the articles of furniture, all of the rituals, all of the ceremonies, everything you see there that goes right back to the instructions God gave Moses, all of that points to Jesus Christ and His ministry. All of it. It's there as a type, as an illustration. That was a concept that many of these people didn't fully understand. He says, we have a high priest. He's in heaven. He's right there at the throne of the Father. And we don't have a high priest that can't be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. We don't have a high priest that can't relate to us and what we're going through, but was at all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Never slipped, never sinned, but He understands what it's like to be human because He was flesh. We're told, understanding that, let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The answer to our problems is to come to the source of help. And to realize we have a high priest that understands firsthand what it's like. He understands what we're going through. He understands what it's like to be a human being. He understands what it's like to get tired or to have to fight off discouragement. Christ went through all sorts of things. Does Christ know what it's like to have people misinterpret your motives? Does He know what it's like to have people say evil things about you when you're trying to do something good and helpful? Does He understand what it's like to have those who are closest to you desert you and turn their back on you in your time of greatest need? Does He understand what it feels like to be a human being? Yes, He does. He absolutely does. And so what we're told is we don't have a high priest that is, He's in heaven, but He's not so far distant that He can't relate to our humanness. And so therefore, we're to come boldly. We're to come with confidence. He goes on, he explains, you see the analogy in chapter 5. He says, the high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, so that he may offer gifts and sacrifices. The role of the priest was intermediary between God and man. Man went through the priest to have fellowship with God. That's the ceremonies of the sacrifices. You didn't just go out and do it where you chose on your own. You had to go through someone. You had to go through the priest. And the instructions in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus were that you came to the place that God had chosen. And it was a serious offense to just pick out your own spot. You came to where God had chosen. You went through the one that God had chosen because the priest's role was as intermediary. So Paul explains that, and he says, these priests are those, chapter 5, verse 2, who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for he himself is compassed with infirmities. The priest, in his role as intermediary, could understand. He could have compassion, because he was a human being too. He had to offer sacrifices for his sins. So he certainly ought to be able to understand when somebody came to him and needed help. Nobody appoints themselves to this office, chapter 5, verse 4. Have to be called of God, as was Aaron. So understand what do we know about the priesthood? Well, the priesthood was there to serve as an intermediary between man and God, to facilitate fellowship between God and man. He was an individual who was able to have compassion because he could understand the problems that people had because he was a person. He had the same problems. It's not something you appoint yourself to. God has to choose you. And so he said, Christ, didn't appoint himself. He didn't glorify himself to be made a high priest. But he said, you are my son. Today have I begotten you. And in another place, he's quoting here from Psalm 110, he said, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now Paul introduces something else, chapter 5, going on into chapter 6, and in particular chapter 7. Now Paul emphasizes, he said, when you go into the law, the Torah, the first priest is not Aaron. That's not the beginning of God's priesthood, is it? That's what they thought. If you'd ask typical Jews, said, who was the first high priest? Oh, well, Aaron was. Paul said, oh no. You're not starting early enough in the book. Turn back a few pages. You go back to Genesis 14. God had a high priest long before Aaron with a glint in his father's eye. God had a high priest in the days of Moses. And you see, then he really began to get into something. The Jews didn't understand who Melchizedek was. They had all sorts of speculation and ideas. But Paul goes through and explains it. Hebrews chapter 6 and 7. He said, now Melchizedek, Hebrews 7 verse 1, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham gave a tithe. Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. Now he interprets Melchizedek's name. He said, you know what that means? Melchizedek means king of righteousness. And king of Salem, that means king of peace. So the one that blessed Abraham and received tithes of Abraham was the king of righteousness and the king of peace. Now you begin to think about that name and that title. That doesn't exactly sound like a human being to attach that title to a human being. Paul goes on. He said, now this Melchizedek was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days or end of life. Now does that describe any person that you know of? No. If you're a person, one thing about you, you've got a father, you've got a mother, you have a definite beginning, and you'll have a definite end. So Jewish speculation, well, maybe Melchizedek was Shem, or maybe he was this or that. Ridiculous. We know who Shem's father was. We know when his days began. We know when they ended. We know what all the days of Shem were. Melchizedek was one who was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Made like unto the Son of God, he abides a priest continually. Melchizedek is still priest. He abides a priest continually. Consider how great this man was, to whom the patriarch Abraham gave a tithe. The Levites, who are descended from Abraham, received tithes. And yet, verse 6, here's one who certainly was not descended from the Levites, and he received tithes from Abraham and blessed him. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. So Melchizedek was far greater than Abraham. Melchizedek received tithes from Abraham. Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Their role was Abraham was the lesser and Melchizedek was the greater. So Paul said, the promises made to Aaron that come from Abraham, that's not the beginning of the priesthood. What you see functioning in Jerusalem, that's not the ultimate. And Paul says, this isn't just my idea. If you go back and read the Bible, you read the Torah, you read the law. Don't start in Exodus, start in Genesis. That's the beginning. And if you read Genesis, you find out God had a high priest long before Aaron ever came along. So, verse 11, if therefore perfection, if completion, if complete fulfillment were by the Levitical priesthood, and it was under it that the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should arise after the order of Melchizedek, not be called after the order of Aaron? Now, what law did the people receive under the Levitical priesthood? Remember, the Levites weren't separated as to function until after the golden calf. The Levites were set aside as the priestly tribe. The book of Leviticus followed. The Ten Commandments were given before all of those things. The law that was given under the priesthood had to do with all of the various ceremonies and rituals, the various things relating to the worship of God in the context of the Levitical priesthood. Now, when the priesthood is changed, verse 12, there's a necessity to change also of the law. Specifically, all the laws that relate to the priesthood and to the temple. Because if you have a change of the priesthood, then all the laws that pertain to priestly function, there's a difference. That would involve sacrifices, that would involve rituals, that would involve all the ceremonies, that would involve the Nazarite purification ceremony that we read in Acts 21. You didn't need a priest, and you didn't need a temple to keep the Sabbath or to keep clean and unclean meats or not to commit adultery or not to steal or kill or worship idols. Those things you could do without any priest, without any temple. But what you couldn't do without a priest and without a temple were all of the ceremonies. Now, if there's a change of the priesthood, there has to be a change relating to the law that defines these things. So, he emphasizes in verse 17 that Christ is the priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, coming on down, explaining the law, verse 19, made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, by which we draw near to God. The law that made nothing perfect was the law that involved all of the ceremonies, all of the rituals, all of the things that they went through in terms of worship. That didn't bring to completion. We have a better hope, which is the means by which we draw near to God. Not through the sacrifice of a bull or a goat, not through various washings, not through various ceremonies. You see, Christ, this man, verse 24, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. He's able to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever lives to make intercession for them. We have a high priest who's holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens. He doesn't need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for himself and then for the people. He did this once when he offered up himself. So, chapter 8. Of the things which we've spoken, this is the sum. Now, I'm going to summarize. Paul says, we have such a high priest who sat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. Every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. Therefore, it's necessary that this man have something to offer. If he were on earth, he wouldn't be a priest because he wasn't one of the descendant of Aaron. There are priests that offer gifts according to the law that relates to these things. But these things serve, what? Verse 5, unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. As Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle, see, says he, that you make all things according to the pattern showed you in the mount. You see, the point is that everything was patterned. All of the earthly items of worship and the ceremony and the ritual were patterned after a heavenly reality. They serve as the example, as the type, as the illustration, as the shadow of heavenly things. The reality is not what you see on earth functioning there in the temple in Jerusalem, Paul said. The reality is the heavenly, and what you see is a copy. He talks about the new covenant, which was prophesied in Jeremiah 31, shows that the problem was not with God but it was with the people. He found fault with them. And this covenant will involve, verse 10, putting the laws of God into their mind and writing them into their hearts. establishing a relationship with them. I'll be their God, they'll be me a people. They'll all know me. And I'll be merciful, verse 12. Unto their unrighteousness, their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. The new covenant involves having the law of God in our hearts. It involves having a personal relationship with God, coming to know God in a very personal way, and it involves having sins removed. You see, the first covenant had ordinances or ceremonies of divine service. It had a worldly sanctuary, a physical sanctuary that you could touch. And he describes some of the various items of furniture. And he says this was a figure, verse 9, a type for the time then present, where were offered gifts and sacrifices that could not make the ones that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience, could not really solve the problem of sin. These things stood only in the meat offerings or the food offerings, the drink offerings, the different washings, and the physical rituals imposed on them until the time of Reformation. Now, this is the law that was involved. What were offered there were sacrifices offered. Sacrifices involved both offerings of flesh and offerings of grain. It also involved drink offerings. Wine was poured out there. If you go back and read the details of the sacrifices back in the Old Testament, back in Leviticus and Numbers, you'll find that the food offering, the lamb, for instance, was also accompanied by cakes of grain and was accompanied by the pouring out of wine. There was food offerings, there were drink offerings, there were different washings. You remember when Paul was going to come into the temple? We read it there in Acts 21. What did he have to do? There was a washing. There was a purification ceremony. You had to wash your body. You had to wash your clothes. You can read the details given back in the Old Testament. There were different washings. The priests had to wash. If they were going to go from one place to the other, they would wash their hands and their feet. They had a big laver there. If they were going to go into the holy place, they changed their clothes, put on priestly garments, and washed their hands and their feet. There were, it says, the King James says carnal ordinances. That just means physical ceremonies. All sorts of physical ceremonies that they went through that were involved there in the temple, that were all tied up in the temple service. Various rituals and things that were gone through. It was an illustration. What was an illustration? The things involving the sacrifices, the washings, and the ceremonies. That was what was temporary. That was what was imposed until the time of Reformation. Christ is come to a greater and more perfect tabernacle. Not by the blood of bulls and goats, verse 12, but by His own blood. So, it's through Him, through His sacrifice, verse 14, that our conscience is purged from dead works to serve the living God. Christ, verse 24, is not entered into the holy place made with hands. These are figures, are types of the true. He's entered into heaven Himself. Heaven itself. So, Paul goes on, you see, explaining the role of Christ and explaining now the connection, the transition. Chapter 10, verse 1, the law having a shadow of good things to come and not the very image of those things can never with those sacrifices which they offer year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect. Which law? What's he talking about? He's talking about the things that related to the ceremonies, the rituals of the priesthood and the temple. That's what's under discussion. He's not talking about murder and adultery and stealing and lying and coveting and all of those other things. He's talking about the things that relate to the worship of God through the Levitical priesthood. That law has a shadow of good things to come. It illustrates through those sacrifices, through those washings, through those ceremonies. It illustrates something. But it's not the reality. So, verse 10, he says, by the which will we're sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. This man suffered once for sin, offered one sacrifice for sins forever, verse 12, and he sat down at the right hand of God. So, our response, verse 19, having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the Holy of Holies by the blood of Christ. Verse 22, let's draw near with a true heart and full assurance. Now he concludes chapter 10 in verse 38, by the just shall live by faith. Chapter 11 tells us what faith is and points to the example of men and women of faith who trusted God, the men and women whose stories they had read in the Old Testament over and over. So chapter 12 says, seeing therefore we're compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, the men and women he's just enumerated in Hebrews 11, we need to lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily besets us. Let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. How do you respond to things dragging on in ways you didn't expect and problems coming along you hadn't thought about and life getting tougher than what you had imagined? And how do you deal with those things? Same way that God's people have always dealt with them, same way that you read about in Hebrews 12. And we look around and see so great a cloud of witnesses, so many others who've gone before. We need to lay aside the weight and the things and run with patience the race set before us. To run with patience. And he goes and explains how God chastens every son whom he loves. How we're come not to Mount Sinai, but to Mount Zion. Not to a physical, but to the spiritual, to what is greater and superior. And if they, verse 25 of chapter 12, if they escape not who refused him that spoke on earth, how much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him that speaks from heaven? We have a greater responsibility. You see, we receiving a kingdom that cannot be moved. Verse 28. So chapter 13, he ends, let brotherly love continue. And he comes on down and explains that in verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. You're going to see a lot of things change, Paul told them. But what you're not going to see change is Christ. He's permanent. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Don't be carried about with different and strange doctrines. All sorts of things are going to be floating around. It's a good thing that the heart is established with grace and not with meats or with meat offerings, the food offerings. That's apparent from the context. They've not profited those that have been occupied therein. We have an altar whereof they have no right to eat, which serve the tabernacle. See, our altar is a different altar. And our heart is established. We're established through God's grace, not through all these physical ceremonies. Those ceremonies haven't solved the problem for the people who've been occupied with it. We have an altar that they don't have the right to eat of. They could eat of the altar in the temple, but they can't eat of the one that we have. You see, the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin, those bodies are burned outside the camp. So Jesus, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, he suffered outside the gate. You see that burning of the body of these animals outside the gate, that was a type of Christ, and he typed it in that he wasn't killed right in Jerusalem, he died outside the gate. Here we have, verse 13, let us go forth therefore unto him outside the camp bearing his reproach. Here we have no continuing city, we seek one to come. See, the Jews had always considered Jerusalem a continuing permanent place. You know, what Paul is explaining to these people is what's permanent is the truth, not the place. That's a concept that, sadly, there are some folks who used to be with us didn't understand a few years ago. They thought the place was continuing. That's where they thought the permanence was. The permanence is the truth. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We don't have a continuing city here. It can be Jerusalem, or it can be Pasadena, or it can be Eugene, Oregon, or it can be San Diego, or it can be wherever. What continues, what's permanent, is the truth. So it's through. We're looking for a city that's permanent. The New Jerusalem is going to come down from God out of heaven. Because you see, we're strangers and pilgrims. That's what he explained in Hebrews 11. We may have to go places and do things that we never imagined. So, Paul emphasizes this and says that emphasizes these relationships, the role of Jesus Christ, what our response must be, and the transition that was taking place in the lifetime of the people who read it. There's some very important lessons here, both in terms of understanding some of the questions that arise in people's mind about the law of God, but also there's a whole focus on the one who is there to help us and to strengthen us, the one to whom we can come boldly in time of need. Paul emphasized these things to God's people at that time. Those same lessons are important and valuable for us today.